Once upon a time, Elle and I lived in a neighborhood in Amarillo, Texas. It was your basic nice place to live. Middle class folks, a combination of young families and older adults, and people like us whose kids were in high school or college or transitioning to their lives beyond. It was the kind of neighborhood where people kept their yards neatly trimmed, and every so often someone might throw a block party. Almost all the homes were mid century modern ranch style houses, but on the edge of our neighborhood was a stark dividing line, a wide avenue running the entire length of the city like a scar. On the other side of that avenue, things were very, very different. The houses were quite a bit smaller, quite a bit older, and on very small lots. And a few of them were neatly kept up, but most were in some stage of disrepair. Mostly rental properties, many with more than one family living in them. Now, our neighborhood was comprised primarily of white people with occupations that were considered professional. That other neighborhood was mostly working class, African American, Latino, and a growing number of immigrant families from places like Somalia. Now, on the opposite edge of our neighborhood from that one was a large modern grocery store, and right in our neighborhood was a very nice public park. That other neighborhood had no public park, no modern grocery store, and it was what sociologists call a food desert, meaning that there were no stores nearby with any fresh fruits or vegetables. Only a few small rundown convenience stores, really, where the only foods sold were things like bags of chips and candy and soda, just junk food. And many of the people living in that neighborhood had no cars, so when they needed to shop at the nearest real grocery store, they had to walk a long way back and forth right past our neighborhood and along the edge of a very busy street that had no sidewalk. They had to walk in the street. It was really dangerous. Now, it had been that way for years. When Elle organized a neighborhood association for our neighborhood, at first as a way to lobby the city to install some four-way stop signs at intersections where there had been some minor collisions or people speeding, that kind of thing. But as that neighborhood group outgrew our living room and had to start meeting in the fellowship hall of the neighborhood Episcopal Church, things got a lot more ambitious. First, we got stop signs. Now we can conquer the world. An annual 4th of July parade and picnic were held at the park, and the park itself got a facelift and began to be enjoyed by a lot more people. I organized a Christmas lights contest because I believe in Christmas lights, and I think cutthroat competition between neighbors really says a lot about Christmas. Not really. It's just good, clean fun. And since I organized it, though, I was the judge. Of course, the winner got to display a cheesy yard sign the rest of the year. It's amazing what people will do for a yard sign. Homemade cookies started showing up on our front porch before the winner was announced, as if I could be bribed by cookies. Do you remember there was this one cookie that was like Rice Krispies and chocolate? Yeah, well, anyway, the biggest project of all, though, was something that not everyone in the neighborhood was 100% comfortable with. At our church, we knew a couple of people who had helped start community vegetable gardens and other places, and they were searching for a location in our part of town. Turns out the Episcopal Church in our neighborhood was located, conveniently enough, on this very large piece of land, most of which was just prairie grass. Long story short, Elle organized people and she got it done. It took grants and gifts from local businesses and a utility company and the buy-in of the Episcopalians, obviously, since it would be right on their property, and folks from our church and the Jewish temple and a few other houses of worship and a lot of sweaty volunteers, but we built a really great community garden. The only two things about it that seemed to confuse people was the fence around the garden and the harvest itself. It was obvious that some kind of fencing would be required to keep rabbits and deer and other critters from eating all the vegetables, so wood posts and wire mesh were donated to complete the fence. But then, at a neighborhood meeting about the design of the fence, one of the neighbors said, "Well, what about a lock for the gate?" When it was explained there would be no lock, the neighbor was confounded. He asked, "Then how will we keep the riffraff from just coming in and taking whatever they want?" Now, he really didn't say riffraff, but we all knew what he meant. So it was then explained again, because it had not sunk in the first time, that the concept for this garden would be that it was open to anyone, whether you had worked on it or not. In fact, we were going to put up flyers inviting the folks who lived on the other side of that broad avenue, the neighborhood that was a food desert, right, to come over and take whatever they needed. And if they wanted, well, they could also help out in the garden. So, no individual or group, even though individuals and groups planted and tended the garden, no individual or group could ever say, "That plot of spinach over there is mine and no one else's." The gate would always be unlocked, and anyone could come in at any time and take whatever they needed. The garden was for both neighborhoods, which meant, of course, that the residents of that neighborhood would be coming over into our neighborhood. Now, it wasn't exactly expressed explicitly, but we could tell from some comments made here and there, that not all of our neighbors were comfortable with that idea, at least at first, with those people coming over and just being able to take food as much as they wanted. In those conversations, it was interesting to watch folks think it all through. Some people were delighted with this concept, while others probably not so much. I don't think anyone realized it at the time, but that community garden was a kind of social experiment in real time in building bridges or making pathways. We've all seen how, in small towns and large cities, that streets and highways and railroad tracks are clear lines of demarcation between a safe and prosperous area on the one side and a not so prosperous and less than safe area on the other. Race and ethnicity have always played a huge role in those borders. Lending practices and redlining and neighborhood covenants kept dark-skinned people out of areas reserved for whites. Whether it's race or economic power, and so often that goes hand in glove, we live in a culture where it's just a given in most places that there's a right side of the tracks and a wrong side of the tracks. There's a reason that saying even exists. Well, since today is Palm Sunday, it's our moment to remember that day, about 2,000 years ago, when Jesus entered the gated city of Jerusalem. We all know the story. As he rode a borrowed donkey, his followers and throngs of others sang songs, waved palm branches, and laid their cloaks down on the road. They were all performing a deeply symbolic act, and you might not know this, it was also a deeply subversive act, because the people in the positions of power and influence were watching this parade, and they also got the symbolism behind it. Anyone riding a donkey into town in that way, being cheered on by a big crowd, was a way of saying to them, today, we are breaking down old barriers. Today, we are ushering in a new way of being. Because that was the manner in which conquering kings of old had always come to town. It was a demonstration intended to proclaim that something new was dawning, a new way of seeing each other, a new way of treating each other. Jesus embodied all of that. For 3 years, he'd been preaching and teaching that the old ways of interpreting God's laws were doing more to separate people than to bring them together. He had healed people who were ritually impure. He had shared meals with the riffraff and the religious rule breakers. His behavior, it was scandalous. It brought together people from all classes of society, all ethnicities, and all faiths. Jesus simply did not discriminate. He never turned away anyone, and he went out of his way to embrace those whom the religious establishment deemed were unworthy. And now, all those unworthies were cheering him on as he entered the city. He went in through a gate in the city walls, but he might as well have been knocking those walls right down. But we also know the rest of the story that week. After the parade, he caused trouble in the temple by railing against those who made a huge profit off of poor people's offerings. In the temple, he taught that week, and large crowds gathered to listen to his ideas about the inclusiveness of God's love. These were ideas that went far beyond the comfort zone of the religious establishment, and when they had heard enough, they conspired to have him arrested and condemned to death for being a heretic. But of course, as we'll celebrate next Sunday, that was not the end of the story, because once you start breaking down old barriers, it's impossible to stop. It may be human nature to build tracks and wide avenues and put locks on gates, to place limits on what we think is acceptable and what's not, on who is acceptable and who's not. But there's also something deep inside of us that is sacred. Abraham Lincoln called it the better angels of our nature. Jesus called it the kingdom of God living inside of us. It's like a light switch that comes on when we can suddenly see clearly that our humanity and identity are only diminished when we seek to place ourselves into categories like race, religion, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or nationality. When that light comes on, when the barriers come down, we see that we're stronger and we're healthier and we're at peace when we treat our neighbors as we wish to be treated, when we actually do to others as we wish to be done to us, when we stop blaming people for their problems, when we don't even recognize the privileges we enjoy because we've never had to deal with those problems ourselves, when we love God with all of our mind, soul, and strength by welcoming the stranger and embracing the outcast, when we live with a mindset and an orientation of our hearts that says there is always plenty and you are welcome to eat from this garden. We witnessed that one night in Amarillo, Texas. It was another neighborhood meeting down at the old Episcopal Church, and on this occasion, the mayor and a certain member of the city council had decided to attend to learn what was going on in this neighborhood, where people had built a community garden and they were sharing in the harvest. They'd heard some interesting things, this council member and the mayor, good things, and they wanted to learn more. So, neighbors stood up and shared. They spoke about how really cool that garden was and how, although not everyone was originally sold on the concept, how great it was that anyone from anywhere could come in and take what they needed. It felt really good to know that, they said. It felt like the right thing to do. So the mayor and the council member listened, and they made an offer. They said, well, you know, what you've done here is so great. We have some money in the city budget, and so we thought that perhaps we could have some improvements made, some upgrades in your neighborhood. Maybe, I don't know, maybe some new equipment for the park. But then a neighbor stood up and said, well, we don't need anything. We're good. But you know, the people who live in the neighborhood across the avenue, they have to walk a long way to get to the grocery store, the real grocery store. Some of them walk a mile or more. And the path they travel to get there is, well, it's very dangerous. Mothers are pushing baby strollers, and older people are on walkers. And they're having to walk right there on the side of the road. It's a tragedy waiting to happen. And there have already been a lot of close calls. So why not take that money you're offering us and build a nice wide sidewalk next to the street for them? The mayor and council member were stunned. A sidewalk that long and that wide would be really expensive, and they could certainly make it happen, but it wouldn't really benefit our neighborhood in the least. It would only serve the folks from the other neighborhood across that wide avenue. Were we sure? The response was overwhelmingly yes, because those are our neighbors too. So the sidewalk was built, and it was wide, and it was long, and it was a safe place to walk. But it was much more than that. It was a kind of bridge. It was a straight pathway that was only created because a barrier separating people had broken down. It was broken by an unlocked garden where everyone was welcome to share in the harvest, where no one was a stranger, and where everyone belonged. Where the better angels of our nature sang, Hosanna, blessed are those who come in the name of the Lord. Where the light in people's hearts shined brightly. And where we're always invited to join in the parade of cheering on the coming of God's kingdom that lives in all of our hearts.